A 2019 paper from the journal Biosciences, co-signed by more than 11,000 scientists, asserted that planet Earth's population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced, and some politicians have questioned the morality of having children at all. Fears of overpopulation and ecological disaster are also beginning to manifest on the far right, mixed in with an anti-immigrant animus. The logic was expressed in its most dramatic and twisted form in the 2019 manifestos of mass shooters in both New Zealand and Texas.
If we can get rid of enough people, he wrote, then our way of life can become more sustainable.
Whether contemporary proponents of these ideas know it or not, they are all intellectual heirs of the misguided 18th century thinker Robert Thomas Malthus, who believed that when human population increased, famine and environmental destruction would ensue.
There is a discussion whether the growing population is connected with climate change, and in particular, the greenhouse effect, pollution, and the heightened carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere.
We now realize that the disasters that continue increasingly to afflict the natural world have one element that connects them all: the unprecedented increase in the number of human beings on the planet. There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus.
In the contemporary world, Malthusianism was most famously expressed through the work of ecologist Paul Ehrlich, especially in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb.
The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. A decade earlier, in 1958...
Which in general terms can be called overpopulation, the mounting pressure of population pressing upon existing resources. This, of course, is an extraordinary thing. Something is happening which has never happened in the world's history before. The whole essence of biological life on Earth is a question of balance, and what we have done is to practice death control in a most intensive manner without balancing this with birth control at the other end.
Your main concern has been the population bomb, as you call it in your book. Do you feel that this takes precedence over any other type of pollution, and certainly human pollution?
Yeah, it takes precedence in the following sense. The reason I named the book The Population Bomb was in 1968 when I wrote it, everybody was getting concerned about pollution, but people hadn't seen the other element. I thought the emphasis ought to go there. The thing that's important to remember about population control is that if we want to avoid a tremendous rise in the death rate, we absolutely must have a tremendous decrease in the birth rate. Now, because the world's population is so young, it means that even if we got a tremendous decrease in the birth rate, if the average completed family size immediately moved down to the vicinity of 2, we would still face 40 or 50 years of rapid population growth. There's a tremendous lag time built into it, because those young people, the 40% of the people in the world that are under 15, are going to have children and grandchildren before they get old enough to die of old age. So we have this tremendous built-in lag time, which means that we've got to start instantly on population control only because we know it'll take so long.
The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed. Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
The only hope that there is that we will be able, at least in the United States, through the political process, to get a government that's courageous enough to say, look, we're overpopulated and we have to have population control, and start moving in that direction.
He compared humanity to a cancer, writing that we must shift our efforts from treatment of the symptoms to the cutting out of the cancer. His proposed solutions included taxing diapers, subsidizing vasectomies, and even spiking food aid and water supplies with sterilizing drugs, and then holding a lottery for access to the antidote. Similarly, ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968 compared humanity to overbreeding cattle, writing that the freedom to breed is intolerable.
The only way to make this system work is to have the family be willing to give up one of its former freedoms, namely the freedom to determine how many children it was going to have.
Ehrlich would turn out to be as wrong-headed as Malthus. Over the next half-century, calories available per capita steadily increased in just about every region of the world, thanks largely to improved agricultural techniques and technology.
But some of the things we did not recommend, we said these are the sorts of things that have been suggested or could be done. A good example is we said in one of our publications that it would be one of the things that might be good if you could do it safely and biologically safely would be to add something to the water supply, excuse my laryngitis, add something to the water supply that would make you have to take an antidote before you could have a baby. And everybody said, that's just terrible, that's ghastly. Ghastly? It'd get rid of the whole abortion problem, get rid of the whole unwanted child problem, make people make rational decisions. It's certainly one of the things that every government must pay great attention to is the size and composition of its population. It's probably the number one thing that should be in government policy. It at least is discussed in Australia. In the United States, you can't even dare discuss it.
The worst part about this proposed system of population control is that it is not just based on a faulty premise, but a premise that is in fact the exact opposite of the truth. We are not facing the ticking time bomb of population explosion at all, but a demographic winter of plummeting fertility, where a growing number of countries, and eventually the world as a whole, will face terminal population decline.
Nearly half the countries in the world are facing what's being described as a baby bust. Now that means they're having insufficient children to maintain their population size. This comes from a new report out today in the journal The Lancet, which finds that there's been a remarkable global decline in the number of children that women are having.
They looked at the data from 1950 to 2017. Basically, in 1950, your average woman was having 4.7 children. Just less than 70 years later, they're having about 2.4 children on average. And that is less than the replacement rate, 2.1 to 2.2.
Right.
But, for example, in countries that have higher rates of child mortality, they also need to have slightly more than this 2.1, 2.2 number. So back in 1950, 0 countries had this problem. Now, as you say, about half the world's countries facing it.
It's becoming harder to hear the crying of newborns in Korea. The nation's birth rate has been on a steady decline over the past 40 years. Currently, it has the lowest birth rate among the 34 OECD member countries. Last year, the number of newborns stood at 436,500, a near 10% decrease from 2012. This means about 8.6 babies were born among a population of 1,000, the lowest since the year 1970, when the government first began recording population data.
Italy is struggling to escape recession and bring down record-high unemployment. Even if it manages that, it may still face its biggest economic challenge ahead, which is having one of the lowest birth rates in the world and a rapidly aging population.
Demographic time bomb is a huge threat, and the solutions to that aren't politically acceptable. Raise taxes, cut benefits, become more productive.
Economists say Italy's problem is that more than a fifth of its population is now aged 65 years or over. And it's estimated that by the midpoint of this century, the population will have fallen by 16 million people.
Low birth rates and economic migration have hit Eastern Europe especially hard, with countries like Bulgaria expecting a 30% population decline in the coming decades.
Japan's leaders are working on a raft of new measures to encourage citizens to get married and have children in a bid to boost the country's flagging birth rate. With fewer babies being born and a rapidly aging population, Japan is facing an unprecedented demographic crisis with vast social, economic and political repercussions.
Spain has always had a low birth rate, but the impact of the financial crisis and high unemployment has further tipped the demographic balance. The number of births per year has dropped almost 13% since 2008. Today, the average household has just 1.3 children, and the average age for a woman to have her first child is 31.
The world's most populous country has a dangerously low birth rate. A recent report from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences says the fertility rate in China is now 1.4 children per woman, close to the global warning line of 1.3 or the low fertility trap. And it warns, once it slips into the trap, no country has ever returned to the replacement level.
Their one-child policy, hailed by population control advocates like EHRLICH, quickly turned into a socially disastrous epidemic of sex-selective abortion and infanticide. Now, its working-age population is shrinking, its retirement-age population is booming, and its 25 to 49-year-old population, responsible for new housing starts and most of the spending in the economy, reached its peak in 2014 and is now in permanent decline. Recognizing the demographic disaster that their attempts at population control helped bring about, the Chinese government officially dropped the one-child policy in 2015.
With its rapidly aging population, Greece is not only facing a demographic time bomb, its young generation is in the firing line of what a sociologist calls genocide or annihilation.
If a country is losing a creative young generation, they have no the means to reproduce itself. This will be a vicious cycle of degradation, of decline of the society.
Fewer babies are being born in the United States. The latest birth statistics, released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, show birth rates in this country are at a record low. Less than 4 million babies were born in the U.S. last year, the smallest number in 30 years.
More than 3.8 million babies were born in the United States last year. But last year's drop in the nation's birth rate, about 2% overall, was the largest drop in a single year since 2010. The rate even fell slightly for women in their 30s. And the teen birth rate continued its dramatic nosedive since the early 90s, down 55% since 2007. Last year, the only group to see a higher birth rate was women in their 40s.
So this report is big news, and on the other hand, not all that surprising. So the U.S. stood out among high-income countries as one that had relatively high fertility. And the Great Recession changed that, and across many high-income countries, the recession resulted in declining fertility rates. The really surprising part is that we've now been quite some years through the recession and unemployment rates is very low, and that trend hasn't changed. So these low fertility rates, despite relatively good economic conditions, are really surprising. Many would see the number of children as an indicator of the well-being of the adult population, from the notion that individuals who are satisfied with their life and have relatively good economic prospects are more likely to have children. The other reason we care about this is that the children born today are obviously the workers 25 years down the road, and are retirees some 60, 70 years down the road. And so the number of births are going to shape the overall size and structure of the U.S. population, and that has a magnitude of implications on both the economic situation and social situation of the United States. So in the long term, if this trend persists, they're going to have profound implication. Any annual number of births probably has relatively small implications. So if we compare the U.S. to other high-income countries, we could see that fertility could drop a lot lower. So total fertility rates drop to rates like 1.2 in many Southern European countries. They're at these levels in South Korea, and we're at somewhat higher levels in Japan. So on one hand, there's quite a bit of possibility for further declines in fertility. And once we get to very low fertility, or what I have called lowest low fertility at some point, then the kind of implications of rapidly aging populations and possibly declining labor force become very difficult to manage through social policies.
Mexico, Italy, South Korea, country after country in every corner of the globe is now facing a population crunch due to a free fall in birth rates and fertility. While there are many factors that play into these trends, political, social, and economic, there are certain scientific factors discernible in the statistics that point to something more nefarious entirely. Since the 1950s, a growing body of scientific literature has documented a steady decline in sperm count of men in certain geographic areas, most notably in parts of Europe and North America. Although there is still vigorous debate over the cause and nature of this decline in semen quality, endocrine-disrupting chemicals such as phthalates that have been proven to disrupt sperm production in fish are being looked at as a potential cause. The bad news is that these offending chemicals are to be found in a bewildering array of products in the modern world, from sunscreen and cosmetics to shower curtains, frying pans, and even cheese.
A new study reports significant declines in sperm count among men from Western countries.
and scientists aren't sure why. The researchers found total sperm count in men from North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand declined by almost 60%, while sperm concentration dropped 52%. Declines in sperm count have been reported since 1992, but previous studies were criticized for small sample numbers and conflicting results. This new study takes a broader approach, looking at more than 7,000 studies from 1973 to 2011.
These findings have wide implications for public health.
Some synthetic chemicals can disrupt or block the functioning of testosterone in the body, permanently damaging the sexual development of male children. This disruption of the human body's own system may be the greatest unintended consequence of the 20th century's chemical revolution.
But regardless of why the world is facing this infertility crisis at this particular moment, it remains the case that the overpopulation fear-mongering has been remarkably successful. Ask 100 people on the street whether there are too many people in the world, and 99 of them will answer in the affirmative.
Today's Malthusians are most concerned about the disruptive effects of climate change. Citing global warming, documentarian David Attenborough described humanity as a plague upon the earth.
I can't think of a single problem that wouldn't be easier to solve if there were less people.
And the Biosciences paper, signed by 11,000 scientists, projects total societal collapse if population isn't managed properly.
We scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat.
It is more severe than anticipated, threatening natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity.
There's a catastrophizing, apocalyptic undercurrent.
Ted Nordhaus, who is a founder of the Breakthrough Institute, which advocates technological solutions to environmental problems, believes the environmental movement has long been hindered by its anti-growth paradigm. The Biosciences paper argues that economic growth is driving overconsumption of resources and says our goals need to shift from GDP growth and the pursuit of affluence towards sustaining ecosystems.
Conventional environmental ideology posits human development and environmental protection oppositionally, and I have exactly the opposite view.
Nordhaus says that the most effective way to deal with climate change is by promoting policies that accelerate economic growth.
If you're really serious about accelerating the decline of fertility rates and the peak and stabilization of global population, you need to accelerate economic development for certainly probably 3 or 4 billion people over the next 3 or 4 decades.
Humans are not only consumers, we're also producers. We're able to create new things, to use resources in better and better ways over time. Human creativity can overcome the problems that Malthusians think that we're going to be suffering from overconsumption.
People in wealthier societies tend to consume resources and generate greenhouse gases at rates that are orders of magnitude higher than those in the third world. But when poor societies become wealthy, there are more people positioned to help solve environmental problems in the only way that really works, with new technology.
Certainly over the next 3 or 4 decades, a lot of development, particularly in poor countries, is still going to be fossil-based. But it could be natural gas and not coal. Or in Africa, for instance, there's huge hydro capacity. In projections of sort of where populations are going to stabilize is really, when you get down to the bottom of it, is just ultimately a question of how rapidly Africa develops economically.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
That's the kind of claim that it doesn't actually enlighten at all. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the real choices we're faced with. What sorts of social and political and economic arrangements we ought to aspire to, for a planet that is pretty soon going to be 9 or 10 billion people. What it's not is going to be agrarian, traditional economies. With 10 billion people, if you ever tried to actually have everybody live that way, we would just cut down every forest in the world, and then we would collapse.
Malthus wasn't completely wrong about the tendency of humans to deplete resources, but he failed to see that new ways of organizing society would ameliorate the problem.
Up until about 2 centuries ago, Robert Thomas Malthus was about right, is that in fact population was regulated by food supply. and something changed. The world understood the role of property rights, for example, the rule of law, and this dramatically changed the incentive structures that people had.
Technology is one of the key things that mediates the relationship between affluence and consumption and impacts. Wealthier, more developed societies are both better positioned to adapt to problems like climate change and climate impacts. A Category 5 hurricane creates a lot more devastation and a lot more loss of life and human impact in a poor society than in a rich society. They're also better positioned to develop and deploy new technology.
Most people believe that the world is a fixed and depleting pie over whose scraps we are condemned to fight. From this perspective, every new baby born into the world is merely a competitor for a limited supply of resources. A human obstacle in the path to abundance. This fixed pie way of looking at the world is the depletionist mindset. More people means less resources to go around. The more of us there are, the poorer everyone will be. This is such an intuitive way of thinking about the world that most people never stop to realize that it is not, in fact, true. Julian Simon, famed economist and author of The Ultimate Resource.
For long, 2,000 years and more, we know that people have believed that if you have more human beings, that there would be less to go around and that economies would develop more slowly than if there were fewer people. We can hang this idea on Malthus for convenient memory. But the idea has simply been that if you have two people trying to work an acre of land, there'll be less output per acre than there would be if there's only one person. That if you have 10 people in the family, there'll be less food and other goodies to go around than if there are only 5 people. Then, perhaps 25 years ago, some economists began to explore the matter and say, let's check it out empirically. Let's look at the evidence that's available to us. Let's consider the sample of countries that we have historically and see if it really works that way. So the first of these was a man named Simon Kuznets, perhaps the greatest economic, demographic, statistical historian that's ever lived. And he looked at the evidence for all the countries for which we have data for the past 100 years to see whether those countries that had faster population growth had slower economic growth. And lo and behold, no such negative relationship. And then he and other people also looked at the countries, a much larger number of countries for which we had data, say, for the past 25 years. And once again, no negative relationship. Exactly the opposite from what the simple-minded Malthusian theory had led us to expect for all these years. This empirical scientific research liberates us to feel good about people in ways that we might not otherwise. We can not only like people and admire them for their individual qualities, but we can also see that people, on balance, are good for other people. On average, people create a little bit more than they use up in their lifetimes. People leave a little bit of good behind them so that each generation is a little bit richer and lives a little bit better than the generation which went before, on average. Now, you're right that there are periods and there are places when we do worse. There are some of us who don't contribute and who use more than we contribute. But on average, people give more to other people than they take. And therefore, we can admire people in the large as well as individually for being creators more than they are destroyers.
Babies are not a burden on the planet, not a cancer that must be eliminated from the face of the earth, but our most precious resource. Among the babies being born today are the inventors and explorers of tomorrow, the artists who will enrich our lives, and the visionaries who will help us to see the world in a way we can't even imagine yet. They will create new technologies that make hitherto unknown and unthinkable resources available to us, and will help to lift billions more out of abject poverty, just as billions have been lifted out of poverty in the decades since EHRLICH first started warning us that the sky was falling. Realizing that the human brain is the only resource that really matters, and starts concentrating on the demographic winter that is the real threat to humanity.